Relationships, that's our topic for today.
Turn on the lights a little bit. I only think it's hard to see.
Bring it brighter. You want me to turn the lights off?
Yeah, you wanna? Does that make this any brighter or not?
No, it's on. No.
You wanna just kill the lights?
Yeah, I heard it doesn't do anything.
So what I'd like to do is think about, first of all, a real world example. So every time we're building data, we're trying to mimic real world, something in the real world, a relationship that happens in the real world, in this case. That might be something in the physical world around us. It might be something in the video game we're building. It might be something in the application, but it's a relationship of things, right? So can anybody think of a good many-to-many relationship? Many-to-many means you have two things, and thing one has many of thing two, and thing two also has many of thing one. I know it seems abstract, but as we come up with some examples, I think we'll tell me your name again?
Dan.
Dan. Okay, sorry, I don't know all your names, so I'm going to ask your names when I call you. Please bear with me.
I guess social media friend network.
A social media friend network. Go on.
So like each person has a bunch of friends.
Yep.
And each of those friends has their own friends, and maybe.
Exactly. So that's actually a special kind of many-to-many, which is self-referential. So like if we had, if we were referencing that in a computer, what kind of class would we build? In terms of people, what would we call that class? What do you think? Maybe like a user, right? User class. I'm just guessing. You call it a person, whatever you want to call it. So like, but the person has many friends. Well, those friends are also people, right? So you're referring back to yourself, but you're exactly right. A friend would have many friends, and that friend would also have many friends, right? So that's a good example. It's a self-referential example. Anybody else think of anything?
Maybe like two separate social media networks, like maybe the MySpace network and then the Facebook network. They might have very similar users, but
so a user, a MySpace user would have many Facebook friends, and a Facebook friend would have many MySpace users. Sure. Similar relationship, right?
I was thinking maybe like Pandora, where every song has a bunch of genres and attributes.
Yep.
And every genre and attribute is attached to a bunch of songs.
Right.
Used to make a network.
Exactly. And if some of you have made it to that lab where we actually have genres. Sure, a genre has many songs. A song could belong to many genres. Absolutely. Right? Is that what you're thinking? Anybody else? What I'd like to do is come up with an example that we can build on today that you guys come up with, hopefully. I'll give you a couple other examples. Well, go ahead.
How about a vegetable has many uses or many recipes, and a recipe has many ingredients. So I guess you can say ingredients to recipes.
So ingredients and recipes is a really good one, right? Because a recipe definitely has many ingredients. And an ingredient belongs to many recipes, or has many recipes, right? That's a really good one, and that's one that we'll see coming up as well. And what's interesting, too, about many-to-many relationships is sometimes that relationship is represented by something that's very familiar to us. Other times it sounds very abstract, like what do you call an ingredient that belongs in a specific recipe? Like, do we have a name for that? We just call it an ingredient, right? So if we were to represent that in data, we would say something like a recipe ingredient, which is like sounds weird, right? But all it's doing is representing that relationship. Sometimes those relationships will hold a little bit of data. In the case of a recipe ingredient, what would a recipe ingredient need to hold? Like there's one more thing that an amount, right? You need to know how much. So sometimes that intermediate relationship will hold extra data. Other times it will just hold that relationship. Okay. Another example would be like doctors and patients, right? A doctor has many patients, and a patient usually has many different doctors, right? Or they might. And that joint table might be like appointments. So that appointment would need like a time and a date and location, so that's holding some information, and it's also something that we recognize. Like, okay, an appointment represents a relationship between a doctor and a patient, right? And that's something that we're all very familiar with. So sometimes these can be a little bit more abstract, sometimes they can be, sometimes they're very obvious. Does anybody want to So we've got songs and genres. We've got recipes and ingredients. Do we want to? Does anybody have a model that we want to build with today? One of those or a different one?
Cells and animals.
Cells and animals. An animal.
An animal has many cell types. Cell types bring many animals.
Cell types. Bring many animals.
Yeah, have many animal types.
So, I guess that could work. So like, give me an example of cell types.
Like, what is it, like skin cell?
Right.
Can be like humans, pigs,
Right.
boars, whatever, right?
But it wouldn't belong to like fish. Or something.
Right.
Okay. That could work. What do you?
Teachers and students.
Teachers and students. A student has many teachers. A teacher has many students. What would the join table, or what would the what would the relationship model look like there?
The joiner would be Flatiron School.
Could be the school. Could be a class. Right. Either one. Those are all good. These are all really good examples. So, do we have a particular one we like to build with today? Recipes? You guys like that one? Recipes and ingredients?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll move forward with that then. Going once, twice? Sold? Okay, fine. So, what I would like to do first, I built a little boilerplate code just to speed things up. New file, I'm going to call it recipe.rb. New file called ingredient.rb. We're going to start off very, very simple. First of all, this boilerplate code should look familiar to everyone, and I'd like you to look it over.
Can you change the font size?
Yes. I'd like you to look it over with binoculars. Okay, there you go. Is that better? Can everybody see that okay? I want you to look over this boilerplate real quick and just tell me if you think, if there's anything here that does not look familiar to you as I'm changing these things up.
What's Faker?
A faker is a gem that allows us to create a whole bunch of random stuff very quickly. So that's not something you need to be familiar with, at least not yet. What does a recipe have? What attributes does a recipe have?
Got a name.
It's got a name, right? We got to call it something. Hang on a second. Name. Okay, quantity.
Serving quantity.
A serving size, maybe, I guess. Like, is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Serving size.
What's the hotkey you use to select multiple?
Command D selects multiple of the same. So if I want to replace my array adder, I just grab it, Command D, as many times as there are those things, and I can just change it.
Is there a way to get Adam to, like, when you select something of a name, it highlights all the other things that have that name?
That's what I just did.
No, but like automatically, like it's not like your cursor is on it. It's like it's highlighting it for you so you can see them.
You're saying when your cursor is
Are you talking about find and like a find and replace?
Well, have you ever used Sublime?
Like this one? Find like this guy?
Yeah, it would work like that, but you would have to do a search. You would just select it. You would just highlight one of those instances, and it would select it up there.
That's what I was just doing. Command D.
You're saying to do it without
Like that?
But yeah, without pressing Command D.
You mean the follow Sublime, right?
I'm confused by what this functionality you speak of. So I've selected name. Okay, yeah, we can talk about some shortcuts as down the road.
Yeah.
All right, so does everything on the screen look familiar to everybody right now? And if it doesn't, please tell me what doesn't look familiar. What does everybody understand the concept of the class variable all? Does everybody understand why? Yep.
We actually go over why the class variable all has the two like ampersand.
Yes. So the double @ sign signifies that this is a class variable as opposed to an instance variable or a local variable. Okay? So an instance variable represented here and here, instance variables belong to an instance of a class, right? whereas a class variable belongs to the entire class. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. Is that the same as doing all capitalized?
No. So all capitalized. So if you had something like, I don't know, you mean like, if we say something like constant equals whatever. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
So this would be a when you put all caps, that signifies a constant, something that's not going to change.
Oh.
Right? That's somewhat universal, not totally universal, but you'll see that in the future as well.
Double colon syntax, does that have to do with the figure in particular? Or
Yep, that has to do with inheritance. So Faker has a module called Star Wars and a module called Family Guy. So don't worry too much about that yet. We'll get into that. That has to do with classes and modules and sharing information. Cool. So besides the Faker stuff, does everything else look okay right now? We're feeling okay about class variables versus instance variables? All right, so recipe right now has a name and a serving size. And what else does it have a whole bunch of that we know? Ingredients. So we're going to take a step back, because even though Nikki kind of got past this, we're going to say, well, let's just keep an array of ingredients, okay? So, and then if we're going to keep that array of ingredients, we need what down here to handle that? Or up here? Yeah, an accessor for that. So let's just throw in ingredients up here. Oops. By the way, what does adder, this shouldn't be reader. What does adder accessor do for each of these things? A getter and a setter method. All it does is it adds two methods. That's it. It's no magic. Cool. So I'm going to copy this whole thing, and I'm going to produce ingredients very quickly with my command D. Ingredient. So what does an ingredient have? What is it?
Amount or quantity.
Ingredient just by itself, as it doesn't relate to anything else, isn't really going to have a quantity yet. We'll get there. A type? A name and a type, I guess? Okay, sure. Type is be careful using the keyword type, or using the word type as a variable, because sometimes in various languages that is a special reserve word.
Maybe it's a food group.
Yeah.
Food group? Let's just do that. That sounds good. Cool. Food group. What was that instead of serving size? Okay. And then instead of ingredients, we would have recipes, right? That's the relationship that we're building here. All right. So we're going to start off kind of simple and say our recipe has a bunch of ingredients. Our ingredients has a bunch of recipes. So these ingredients and recipes aren't really going to make much sense. But let's just see kind of what they look like and start playing around a little bit. Question?
Do you have to require these relatively?
I sure do. You'd see a big old fat error when we run this if I didn't. Recipe and ingredient. Okay, cool. So all I've got here, by the way, in my run file is I'm requiring my files. I'm throwing in a binding. And the only reason I have puts goodbye is because sometimes binding doesn't like to be the last thing in a file. So I have that puts goodbye to make sure that it catches. Cool? Yep.
really quick question about the path syntax. Does dot slash even do anything? Can you just get rid of that and then do the same?
Let's try it.
Doesn't that mean like this directory?
It means this directory, yes. Sorry
Right,
to
if
answer
it's
you.
already in this directory. Can it just know that something's in there already?
Let's try it. Apparently. Yep. So we're good. If you're in the same directory, we don't need the dot slash. Yep.
If you're not, you need it, right?
Pardon?
If you're not, you need it, right?
Yes. If you're not in the same directory, you definitely need to tell the program where to go look for it. It's not going to look anywhere but itself if you don't give it directions.
So you only have to require stuff, does it run those instances each man?
Yeah, so I'm just running the run file, which is grabbing all the code from the other files as well. Okay? So now you need to get your binoculars back out. Let's open up terminal and make this thing a little bigger for you. Okay, so just never mind that the ingredients don't really make sense. Darth Maul add a delicious dash of Darth Maul with a pinch of Poe Dameron.
Synth is part of the world.
That's right. So now we seem to have our ingredients. We have our recipes, and oops, recipe.all. Cool. So let's grab our first one in our first recipe, for example. Does anyone know the method I'm going to use? And that's Frist. Frist is a little known. Just kidding. First. Okay. First is just an array method. So it lets you grab, arrays come with first and last methods, so it just lets you grab the first or last element. So now I've got R as my first recipe, and if I want to, I can grab an ingredient, right? Ingredients. Well, if you tell me, how do I access the ingredients? R.ingredients. Cool. And what did that give me so far? An empty collection, because I don't have any yet, right? Does that make sense? Cool. So how would I add an ingredient? Ingredients is an array. Right now it's empty. I want to add an ingredient to this recipe named R. By the way, what's R's name? I don't even know. To the Newt Gunray. Whatever that may be, I don't know.
Use a shovel operator.
Okay. R.ingredients. Shovel in. What should I shovel in? Well, I want to grab an ingredient that already exists or make a new one. So what I'm going to do is say ingredient dot first. Ah. What did I miss? Okay. So now my R.ingredients is populated with a single ingredient. Cool. Now this recipe now has ingredients, right? So my first recipe has an ingredients of Sabine Wren. Okay? Did I say that right? I don't know. But, so wouldn't it make sense now if my ingredient Sabine Wren, which is my first one, I'm going to say I equals ingredient dot first. What do I? Ingredient dot all dot first. Okay. Shouldn't this guy know about the other one? Like, wouldn't it make sense if I click I.recipes that it should refer back and show me that first recipe? Nod if you think that would make sense, and shake your head if you think that's insane. Okay.
It should.
But it doesn't. How come?
You don't know it should.
I've only added the ingredient to the recipe. I haven't added the recipe to the ingredient. So now I have to take the time to say, okay, I.recipes and shovel back in the recipe dot first. Man, I'm failing on that a lot today, huh? All right, so now this makes a little bit more sense, right? I.recipes has this recipe, which, by the way, notice that when you show this recipe now, its associated ingredients are coming back as well. Do you see that? So now we actually have the association. Does that make sense? I.recipes, we have a single recipe, which also shows its ingredients, its name, and its circumstance. Does that make sense? So now we kind of have completed this association, but notice how it was like we kind of had to take an extra step to do it. We had to tell one guy, hey, you have this ingredient. And we had to tell the recipe, hey, you have this ingredient. We had to tell the ingredient, you have this recipe, explicitly in separate places. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just do it one time and they would both know about each other?
Yep, let's try that.
But wait, there's more. That's what we're going to do. Okay. Sorry, that was a terrible book. All right. Thanks. So let's go back and look at this a little bit, and we're going to refactor. Let's see. who does anyone want to give this a shot who has gotten this far in the labs or kind of just on their own? Like, what are we going to do here to fix this problem?
Create a join table.
We are going to create a join, in this case, a join model, right? A join table is what we're going to be building once we get to building databases. In this case, we're going to build a join model. What should we call this join model?
Recipe ingredient.
Recipe ingredient. Sounds good to me. When we're building a join model, that's typically what we're going to do. Is we're going to, if the idea doesn't make sense as something we're familiar with, like with a doctor-patient, a join model might be an appointment. But in terms of a recipe, if it doesn't have that noun that's familiar to us, we will just take the names of each one and put them together. So I'm going to create, what do you want to call it? Recipe ingredient. This is going to be the name of the file, and then the class. Okay, and it's pretty much that simple. Well, as far as naming convention goes, it's that simple.
It's a spelling.
But I should spell things right. You're right. Excuse me. So what does this look like? Help me out.
Should initialize or something.
Yeah, it should initialize. And what should it initialize with?
The recipe and ingredient.
Yep. Oh, I guess I'll put them in the order that it's listed here, recipe ingredient. Now, would it ever make sense to build one of these things without a recipe and an ingredient? Like to have this is a join model. All it's doing is saying you recipe belong to you ingredient. Would it ever make sense to build it with just one? Anybody? Does anybody think it would? Does anybody think it wouldn't? And it sounds loony? Is anybody in La La Land sleeping or drifting off? I know it's a long time this morning sitting in your chairs. I wouldn't think it. I don't think it would. Most times when you're building a join model, it would not make sense to just have one, because all this is representing is a relationship between two other models. And if you don't have both models, what are you're representing a self relationship? It doesn't really make sense.
Could you leave ingredient as a default and be have one recipe have all the ingredients? Like if you don't have one of them, have a default to all of them.
I'm going to say no. You might default like a recipe to grab all the ingredients, but you would still want to create a single recipe ingredient. The only job of this model is to represent a relationship between a single recipe and a single ingredient. That's it.
So you don't want to do it in pairs.
Yeah, it's always just going to be that. Yep.
Is there a limit that you can or should make with class relationships within a model?
Is there a limit that you should or shouldn't make within class relationships? I'm not sure if I fully understand your question. I'm going to say no. If you have to make relationship,
Like, let's say there was another factor besides recipe ingredient, like an X third factor, right? Should you make like an independent model if you needed to link the three, or would it go within one?
You're typically. It kind of depends. Like, I'm going to say that that's something that will become more clear as you're building code, like whether you're going to build, basically the question is whether you're going to build a join model every time you have this kind of relationship.
Like, if you're building a join model, does it ever have more than two factors, like recipe, comma, ingredient? Like, can it ever have three factors?
A three-way join model?
Yeah.
I suppose you possibly could.
And would you do it, if you could, would you do it in one join model or more?
I don't know. Andrew, you ever heard of a three-way join model?
Yeah, actually, one of our Module 5 students did it last time. It can get kind of hairy, but if you need, like, if there's a many to many to many with three objects, yeah, I guess you could do it.
Yeah, it might get a little tricky.
But should you do it? That's also.
I would say if you get the more you can keep your code simple, the better. That's a good rule to adhere to every time you're building any kind of program. Period. Like, keeping it simple is always going to be better. And if it's really easy in building relationships for them to get out of hand and kind of crazy, and you want to try and avoid that. That said, I'm not going to make a blanket statement that you can't build models in relationship this way or that way or another way. And every time you're building a project, we'll always sit down and talk to you about your relationships and make sure that they make sense. Does that make sense? Is that helpful?
Yeah.
I know it's not a straight answer, but it's, there's a lot of gray. So what is this going to keep looking like? What do you guys think? What goes inside of here? Guesses?
Maybe you tell the ingredient with ingredient something that you own this recipe and the recipe that you own this ingredient. Like build it all. Do we do that?
Well, so we don't have it all yet. We do want to fill the all. So I'm going to build an all class variable for this guy as well. And like you just said, Mohammed, we're going to populate that with self.
Can you map their relationships using a hash for ingredients as keys and recipes as values and recipes as keys?
We could, but we're not going to. Not in this case, anyway. We could totally build out a hash if we wanted to.
Why wouldn't we just do what we were doing before, but inside this function to automate it for us? Like when we were back in the, I think it was it ingredient recipes that you put that code in.
Where?
When you did it, when you joined it manually.
When I was in terminal?
Yeah. Why couldn't we just do those commands inside of the initialization?
We could, but the problem is, so suppose that, so in other words, you're saying inside it, actually, what are you saying? Tell me.
Yeah, take those commands that you use to join them manually inside of the console and just put them sequentially into the initializer so that all the initializer does is what you do them except for you.
So like something like this?
Yeah.
So you mean like, say something like
Self.
Recipe dot ingredients and shovel in ingredient? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
And then do the same thing, switch them around, dot recipes. Is this what you mean? Because there's a couple of reasons why we're not going to do this. One is that first of all, we're going to completely eliminate this, okay, and this, because we want what we're going to do is we're going to separate our concerns, and we're going to put each class is going to be responsible for knowing about itself, and it's going to be the job of the recipe ingredient to know about the relationships that exist. So part of what we're doing is separating out and putting everything in one place. Does that make sense? Did you have a question, Arby?
Did you make a single global hash then?
We could, but we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that. Let's keep moving forward with this guy. What should go in? What do you think ought to go inside of this initialize method? Right now, I'm taking in a recipe and an ingredient, and I'm building this thing called a recipe ingredient, which seems abstract, but all it is doing is representing a relationship. What's that? I couldn't even hear. I'm sorry. No, I'm not going to call it classes. This is its own class. I'm going to create an instance of this class. An instance of the recipe ingredient is going to just contain information about this relationship.
Could you just make a hash of both the recipe and the ingredient hashed together, like using the recipe as the key and then the ingredient as the value, and then you do something like that?
I could. I'm not going to build a hash. So no hashes. Sorry, guys. I could do that, right? I could build this sort of weird object this hash that sort of represents this model instead, and I don't know where I'd put it. Have to be living somewhere global or maybe living in both, which would be weird. And that's not the pattern that we want to go down.
When it's calling recipe, what's it calling?
Here?
Like, yeah, no, under the initialize.
Here?
On the argument. Initializing the argument recipe.
These are the arguments that are getting passed in. So when we
what's
say
the
recipe
format
ingredient,
of that?
pardon?
What's the format of that? Like,
That's going to be an actual recipe, a recipe instance. An instance of the class recipe.
it's going to be an instance of the class recipe. So, okay.
So let me just show you. Let me just see if this makes sense. First of all, let's real quick check and see if Faker has food. I bet they do. Faker, food. There we go. Perfect. They have food.ingredient. What do you think about that? That sounds almost like it's just what we need. Ingredient.new food ingredients. They don't have food group, but that's okay. So I'm going to say serving size equals 0 as. Do you understand what I just did there?
Default value,
I made a default value. What does that allow me to do?
not passing serving size.
Right. Is everybody clear on that? Does everybody need that repeated? Okay. Cool. And let's see, what are the chances they have recipes too? Recipe food. I guess not. How about dish? We'll call it dish. That sounds good. So in recipe, this will look a little bit more real. Food, dish. Wait, recipe, food, dish. And I'm going to do the same thing with serving size. I'm going to give it a default value of, I don't know, 1. Okay. I'm going to save this. What class method do I need here that I don't have yet? An all getter. You got it. How do I do that? Cool. Right now, I can only access this recipe and this ingredient. Actually, I have really no access to them. So how can I fix that? Let's give it an accessor. We'll say maybe sometime we might want to change them. I don't know. And what's one other thing, and what we talked about, what should this table maybe hold? Because when it comes to a relationship in real life between a recipe and ingredient, what's that one more piece of data you would need?
Serving size?
An amount, right? Like if I have a recipe, it says carrots, I need to know how many carrots, right? So let's just say amount. Again, I'll give this a default to 1 teaspoon. And I'll add that here too. Okay, is everybody okay with this so far? Who's feeling a little shaky, like what in the world's going on here? Who's like, I got this? Who's somewhere in between? Who's listening? Okay, good. All right. All right, so let's check this out. We're going to run this back and see if I broke anything. Doesn't look like anything's too bad. Let's check out all my ingredients. Cool. Now that looks a lot more realistic, right, than Star Wars characters. And recipe.all. Cool. This is looking a little more better, right? So suppose now I want to, yeah.
Could you do it with a two-dimensional array? Because if you think about it, you could almost think about recipes and ingredients being on a matrix.
Yep.
And like
That would be similar to a hash, right?
Sort of.
You'd be building the relationships and holding them in the array that's able
Yeah,
to go a little deeper than just like a list,
yeah.
you could do that. But again, we're going to stick with simplicity and with a good convention that's going to work for us as we go forward. Okay? And so suppose that my first recipe is pasta and beans. So I'm going to grab that into a variable. Okay? And which of these ingredients, well, we could make a new ingredient too. What do I want to add as an ingredient to pasta and beans? Cabbage. Okay, pasta, beans, and cabbage. So if I want to make a recipe ingredient, I've got my first recipe as pasta and beans, and it looks like cabbage is my second ingredient. Based on building this recipe ingredient table, like what steps am I going to take now to move forward, to make this relationship happen?
Recipe ingredient new.
Okay. What am I going to pass in?
Recipe R first,
Cool.
and then ingredient that all in brackets. Like that.
That's right, because 1 in brackets gives me the second ingredient. Cool. So now, uh-oh. Did I require that yet? Ah. Okay, will help. All right, so recipe, now I have to look again because they're all going to be different. Okay, so suppose I want to create association here. Somebody go ahead and pick one and let me know what you want to do between these two.
Unbleached flour and pizza.
What's that?
Unbleached flour and pizza.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to say recipe ingredient dot new, and it takes a recipe first, which is the recipe dot all the number 2, which is represented by index of 1, and ingredient dot all with an index of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? Did I count that right? Amazing. Cool. So now I have this new recipe ingredient. Awesome. So now if I go to recipe.all, let's see, number 1 is pizza, right? Now if I say recipe.ingredients, do I have anything? I have to finish building this out, right? So, does anyone want to take a stab at what we're going to do next? We're going to build a method. We are. Let's start on recipe for our ingredients. Okay, we don't need this guy anymore. And how's this going to work?
Could search the recipe ingredient all array to find everything that has that as a recipe, I guess.
Exactly. In fact, I'm going to build 2 methods and do exactly what Alec just said. Alec, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And let's start with recipe ingredients. What would that look like? If I want to know all the recipe ingredients that belong to this recipe, how would I write that out? Anybody want to give it a shot? What kind of a method am I inside of? An instance method. Cool. What's my self refer to? The instance that I'm talking about. Cool. How am I going to write this method? Anybody want to help me out?
Select,
Why select?
because we want to pull out the group of them.
Everybody cool with that? Select? I think select is the absolute perfect thing to use right now. Okay, and which ones am I gonna select?
Anything where the recipe is equal to self.name.
Recipe ingredient dot
Recipe.
recipe. Cool.
So,
Does that look good to everybody? Somebody want to raise your hand and just explain what that's going to return? What's this going to give me? This line, line 21, is going to return true or false. And when we're inside of select, what does that do?
selects everything for which that returns true.
Right, and it'll select whichever recipe ingredient I'm iterating through at that, iterating on at that moment. Right? So if it's inside of the select block, returns true. It's going to grab this recipe ingredient. If it returns false, it's going to discard it, and it's going to finally end up with an array, right? A new collection. Select gives us a new collection. Awesome. So now I have a way of accessing just the recipe ingredients that belong to this particular recipe. So how am I just going to get the ingredients now? I'm going to I'll give you a hint, I didn't build that last method for no reason. Anybody?
Select the recipe ingredients, like the second element in each.
What do you mean by the second element?
Oh, yeah. So I mean you have an array of pairs, right? Where it's the same recipe over and over again, and the ingredient.
But they're
Yeah, but these are recipe ingredient objects. These are instances of recipe ingredient of the class recipe ingredient. Each one of them holds a recipe and an ingredient, and in this case an amount as well.
Right, but recipe ingredients doesn't have you can't call a method on that because that's an array, right?
This is an array.
Yeah.
I'm calling this method recipe ingredients. By the way, the implied receiver here is self, so this is technically self.recipe ingredients, which refers to this instance method. Okay, so the return value of which is an array, like you said.
Yeah.
So I can call an iterator on this. What do
Right.
I want to get here? What do I want from this ingredients array? This ingredients method?
The second element of each of the elements of that array.
No.
ingredients.
I want the ingredients. So this is a collection of recipe ingredients. All I want in my ingredients is just the ingredients from it.
Right, and the ingredients are that array has pairs, right? Each element of that array is a pair of. What is a recipe ingredient individual?
A recipe
object?
ingredient is an object of the class recipe ingredient, and it holds a recipe,
Okay, I get
an ingredient, and a value. All I want are the ingredients. How can I grab them? What's that?
Wouldn't you do recipe ingredient dot all dot select do recipe ingredient dot ingredients equals self?
Select. I could do something like that. I could do this in one fell swoop. I'm trying to break it up to make it a little easier. So you're saying that up here I could have just returned the ingredients. So I could have used something like I couldn't have used select. Select will only grab. Select wants a true or false return inside the block, and it will only grab the thing that we're iterating on. We could use something like collect or a map, okay, which are aliases for one another. And we could grab, we could map over all of the recipe ingredients if they're the same, if this is true, and then we would. What's the one thing that would happen there if we used map here and just grabbed the ingredients in one shot? Does anyone know? We would end up with a whole bunch of. We'd end up with a bunch of nils. Does everybody hear that? Okay, we'd end up with any time that this is not true. Because map and collect will give you the same size collection. It's going to map every piece of a collection to a new collection, no matter what, even if it's nil, even if you don't satisfy whatever logic you want to grab. So we could do that, and we could then call the method compact to get rid of all those nils, and that would work. But I like the idea though of being able to reference all of a recipe ingredients as well as grabbing all of its ingredients. That's just me. So that's why we're breaking this down a little bit. Is that okay? Does everybody see why I'm doing that? So then what do we want to do? What do I want to do here? Here's where I want to use map or collect, right? They're the same thing. And here I don't even need to break this into multiple lines. I'm just being very verbose with, does everyone know what verbose means? I'm being very explicit about naming my variables. And you should be careful to do that too. You can use little shortcuts here and there, but make sure you're using the correct, whether we're dealing with a singular or a plural, and identify what it is you're iterating over carefully so that you don't confuse yourself in your code. So what do I want to grab here? Exactly. Okay. So now I have a way of seeing all my recipe ingredients and all my ingredients from a single recipe. And let's just check that this works. So now if I exit, run it back, make that association again. I don't know what these are going to be, but that's okay. We'll find out. Looks like we put peppercorns in lasagna. That makes sense, right? A teaspoon of peppercorns in lasagna. That's actually pretty good for rolling the dice. So now if I say R equals, which recipe was this? Recipe number 2. R dot ingredients. What do you guys think? It's gonna work? Hey, cool. Now, but the cool thing now is, well, we haven't built it out yet. The cool thing is, if I take this, copy it, and I plop it over into ingredients, and now this is going to stay. What's going to change here on my recipe ingredients method? That's the only thing it changes, right? And then in ingredients, here. This is also called recipes. Okay? So now, exit one more time, run it back. I don't think we're going to get as, let's see if we get what kind of recipes and ingredients we end up with here. All right, dragon fruit in your pasta carbonara. You know, this is a new thing. It's a new taste. It's a new flavor. We're mixing Italy and South America. You know, it's like a
Fusion.
It's a fusion. That's right. This could go somewhere, guys. So now let's grab recipe number 1. I is ingredient number 4 or number 5. Now if I say R dot ingredients, I get my ingredients. If I say I dot recipes, I get my recipes. Does that make sense? And the nice thing now is, like, suppose I want to delete this thing. Like, I don't think that, you know what? I don't think that dragon fruit really belongs in pasta carbonara. Which my grandmother-in-law would be really upset that I'm saying carbonara. She says I must say gabinara. Gabinara. Right? Did I do that right for you Italians out there? So how can we delete this? Anybody know? Anybody know how I can delete something from an array? What's that? Pop? That would work. Oppo? Cool. And then if I say R dot ingredients, it's gone. Same thing if I say I dot recipes, also gone. Does that make sense? And see how now we just have this relationship that's representing, I should say we have this model that's representing the relationship, and all we have to do is adjust that model, and it's now, bam, available in both other. Now we make this, we make one instance of this joint model, and the associated models now know everything they need to know. that make sense? We're going to see this pattern a lot going forward. We're pretty much out of time. It's lunchtime. Does anybody have any burning questions though right now? Everybody feeling okay? Raise your hand. Well, you don't have to raise your hand. But if you're feeling really lost, if you're not really sure what's going on, please talk. Come hit one of us up. Yeah.
Can you just put up the ingredient RP screen again? I just
This guy?
yeah.
I'll make this code available. I'll put it up on the lecture GitHub. So, all right, guys. Thank you very much. Have a good lunch. You could put me in the joiner again because I haven't done that. To kind of that me a little bit. Hang on, give me 1 second to stop the screen share. If I can find it. Quick joiner.